In Hollywood's golden age, size was never just a number, it was a carefully engineered illusion. They appeared towering, heroic, unreachable. They strode across silver screens like gods, their silhouettes stretching to the rafters of ornate movie palaces. And yet, when the cameras stopped rolling, some of the biggest legends barely reached eye level with their co-stars. This was the era of smoke and mirrors, of apple boxes and camera tricks, of trench-dug co-actor platforms and careful blocking. Image was everything, and height, for many, was a secret carefully guarded behind studio gates. But the truth is stranger than fiction, because some of Hollywood's most commanding presences were barely over 5 feet tall. Some weren't even close. These were actors who defied physics, who made audiences believe they were larger than life, even when the measuring tape said otherwise. And their stature didn't define them, it empowered them. This is the untold story of 10 Golden Age icons who were shockingly short. Number 10. Mary Pickford, under 5 feet. The Princess of Hollywood, forever in miniature. On screen, Mary Pickford sparkled like the morning sun, radiant, innocent, and impossibly youthful. She was America's sweetheart, a darling of the silent era whose every curl and fluttered lash captured the soul of a nation just learning how to dream in pictures. But behind the soft focus lenses and childlike roles stood a woman of astonishingly petite stature. Just under 5 feet tall, Mary Pickford was, in every measurable way, tiny. And yet, the empire she built, physically, financially, and emotionally, was colossal. From the very beginning, her height was both her mask and her tool. At 25, she was still playing 12-year-olds. In Pollyanna, Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm, and Little Lord Fauntleroy, audiences wept and cheered for a little girl, never realizing they were watching a fully grown woman. Her small frame made it easy to sell the illusion. Her immense emotional intelligence made it unforgettable. But this wasn't just a gimmick, it was survival. In an industry that chewed up aging women, Mary's childlike appearance gave her longevity others could only dream of. Her voice hadn't yet met the microphone, but her power was undeniable. She co-founded United Artists. She helped shape the Academy. At a time when women were expected to be ornamental, Mary Pickford was running the studio from behind her delicate silhouette. And yet, that very image, the tiny sweetheart, the angel in pigtails, trapped her. When talkies arrived and maturity became audible, the audience recoiled. They didn't want a grown woman with thoughts and desires. They wanted their pocket-sized princess forever. The thing that had made her a titan now became her shackle. By the 1930s, Mary had retreated from the screen. She lived in Pickfair, a mansion fit for royalty, but within its halls, the whispers of lost innocence echoed. Her small stature was no longer an asset. It was a painful reminder of the roles she could no longer play, and the world that had outgrown her even as she'd finally grown into herself. Still, what she left behind was monumental, not just films, but infrastructure, a blueprint for women in film. For a woman just shy of 5 feet, she loomed larger than any star before her. She was the first to show that in Hollywood, size was a myth, and sometimes the smallest figures cast the longest shadows. Number 9. Joan Crawford, 5 foot 3 inches, a goddess on stilts. Joan Crawford didn't walk into a room. She conquered it. With cheekbones that could cut glass and a stare that made grown men wilt, she ruled the screen with the presence of a woman twice her size. Yet, in the hush of candid moments, amid the clatter of costume fittings and camera setups, the truth lingered quietly. Joan Crawford was only 5 feet 3 inches tall. It's not that Joan tried to hide her height. She didn't have to. The studios did it for her. On screen, she looked statuesque. Her entrances were choreographed, her angles calculated, her wardrobe tailored to elongate and mystify. Shoulder pads became her armor, high heels her weapon. She learned how to walk in them like she was walking into battle. In person, fans were sometimes surprised, startled even, by her compact frame. This woman, whose performances in Mildred Pierce, Grand Hotel, and Possessed had burned into the psyche of a generation, didn't loom in life the way she did in celluloid, but that was the magic of Crawford. She didn't need to be tall to dominate. Her aura did the heavy lifting. She knew what the audience wanted. They wanted glamour, untouchable, glossy, bigger-than-life femininity. And Joan, like a master illusionist, gave it to them with precision. She stood in her marks, wore her lifts, and stared down the lens like it owed her something. But privately, she was never satisfied. She fretted endlessly over how she appeared on screen. Was her chin lifted enough? Did the camera catch her good side? Was she small? The insecurity gnawed at her. She compensated with control of sets, of co-stars, of her own children. And when her career began to shift, when younger, taller, softer faces started to steal the spotlight, Joan didn't shrink. She fought. Her final roles were fierce, even grotesque. Whatever happened to Baby Jane? Joan Crawford as cruel as she was broken, still desperate to be seen as towering. In the end, the illusion held. The legend endured. Even in death, Joan Crawford remained a cinematic skyscraper, forever looming, never diminished. Height, irrelevant, she made the world look up to her. Number 8, Bette Davis, 5 feet 2 inches, short in stature, towering in ferocity. There was nothing soft about Bette Davis. Her voice was a challenge, her eyes unforgiving. Her performances weren't designed to seduce, they were designed to devour. And yet, there was something quietly astonishing about her physical reality. Bette Davis stood at just 5 feet 2 inches tall. She didn't read small on screen. She read formidable. She smoked like a threat, moved like she owned the space, and never deferred. There was an edge in her every glance, a defiance that pulsed beneath her skin. In a Hollywood defined by towering blondes and sweeping ball gowns, Bette cut a different figure. Sharp, cerebral, untouchable. Her size was not a hindrance, it was a weapon. Directors didn't know what to do with her at first. How could a woman so tiny dominate a scene without relying on traditional beauty? But Bette didn't need beauty. She had presence, the kind that didn't just draw the camera, it commanded it. Still, she was aware, keenly. She knew she wasn't built like Garbo or Dietrich. She wasn't the studio's ideal. She knew she didn't fit the statuesque mold. So, she shattered it. In All About Eve, she didn't tower over her co-stars. She towered through force of will. In Jezebel, she made femininity dangerous. In Now, Voyager, she redefined what it meant to transform. Behind the scenes, the size disparity was often joked about by others, but Bette never let it touch her. Her quick wit, acid tongue, and legendary refusal to back down made her seem 10 feet tall. Joan Crawford was her equal in height, but never in combat. Bette stood taller in every fight they waged, and in the end, the cameras adjusted to her. The audience adjusted to her. The world bent to her. Because when Bette Davis walked into a scene, it didn't matter how tall she was. It only mattered that she was there. Number 7, Humphrey Bogart, 5 feet 8 inches. The illusion of a giant. He was the man every other man wanted to be, and the one every woman wanted to tame. The trench coat, the fedora, the cigarette dangling from a curled lip. Humphrey Bogart wasn't just a movie star. He was a myth, a walking archetype of cool, carved in shadows and smoke. And yet, he was not tall, not really. At 5 foot 8, Bogey was only slightly below the national average. But in the world of Hollywood leading men, towering figures like Gary Cooper and Gregory Peck, he was noticeably compact. And in an industry obsessed with scale, 5 foot 8 was quietly, persistently small. But Bogart never let height define him. Instead, he leaned into everything else. The voice, the swagger, the slow-burning confidence that turned every line into prophecy. Directors knew how to shoot him. Co-stars, particularly women, were often framed seated or angled, so he appeared taller. In Casablanca, the chemistry with Ingrid Bergman worked in part because she stood just an inch or two shorter, allowing the illusion to thrive. In The Big Sleep, he stood nose to nose with Lauren Bacall, who wore flats on set to keep him towering. Yet, it wasn't just the camera tricks. Bogart's power came from his stillness. He wasn't a man who needed to fill the frame. He anchored it. He could stand in silence and make it feel like thunder. He didn't need height to be imposing. He had authority in his breath. Still, the studios noticed. Early in his career, he was cast as criminals and second fiddles, men who schemed in the shadows, not those who claimed the spotlight. It wasn't until his 40s, well past the age most actors peaked, that he became a romantic lead. Casablanca, To Have and Have Not, Key Largo, all proof that charisma could rewrite the rules. Bogart was the ultimate contradiction, the scrappy outsider who became the archetype of cool, the man who didn't look like a hero but was. His size never mattered because he knew something other stars didn't. The audience wasn't looking for a tall man. They were looking for someone real, and Bogey, he gave them that and more. Number 6. Peter Falk, 5'6". Short, scruffy, unstoppable. He wasn't polished. He wasn't glamorous. He didn't stride into scenes like a god. He shuffled in, muttering to himself, looking like he might have lost his way to wardrobe. But when Peter Falk appeared on screen, everything stopped, because at 5'6". Peter Falk didn't need to rise above the crowd. He just needed to be real. To most of the world, he'll forever be Columbo, the disheveled detective in the wrinkled raincoat, the man with the wandering eye, the stammering questions, and the final gotcha line delivered as he turned back. Just one more thing. He looked like a man you could ignore. That was the trick, the illusion, the genius. In truth, Falk's height was one of many attributes that set him apart in Hollywood. He didn't fit the mold. He wasn't a pretty boy. He wasn't leading man material, at least not in the way casting directors traditionally understood it. But he had something else, authenticity, and audiences felt it. Falk didn't hide his height. He used it. In Columbo, he became a kind of reverse predator, underestimated by suspects, dismissed by arrogant killers who looked down on him, literally and figuratively. And yet, episode after episode, he outsmarted them all, delivering justice with a twinkle in his eye and a world of empathy behind every question. Off-screen, he was fiercely intelligent, artistic, quirky. He lost his right eye to cancer as a child, which only added to his distinctive look and his unshakable confidence. "Being different," he once said, "isn't something you fight, it's something you use." That applied to everything, including his size. He took roles that didn't require him to tower. Wings of Desire, The Princess Bride, A Woman Under the Influence. In each, his height was irrelevant. His soul was what mattered. Peter Falk proved that greatness wasn't about stature. It was about surprise, depth, timing, humanity. You couldn't see those things in a tape measure, but you could feel them every time he turned back and said, "Just one more thing." Number 5. Alan Ladd, 5'6". The Man on the Box. He was a storm in silence, brooding, controlled, eyes like steel, voice like gravel. Alan Ladd wasn't just a movie star. He was the quintessential mid-century American male, quiet, rugged, and impossibly handsome. Women swooned, men emulated. On screen, he looked invincible, but in truth, Alan Ladd stood just 5'6" tall. In a world of 6-foot cowboys and looming war heroes, that presented a problem. Hollywood's leading man formula demanded height. Alan had everything else, but not that. And so, the illusion was born. He stood on boxes, apple crates, ramps were built, camera angles were tilted, trenches were dug for his taller co-stars. In Shane, his most iconic role, he was shot from low angles, framed against mountains, or shown towering over actors positioned a few steps downstage. It worked. Millions believed in Shane's mythos, the lonely rider who could face down evil and disappear into legend. But behind the scenes, Alan was weary of the illusion. He was a deeply sensitive man, plagued by insecurity. His height haunted him, not because of how he saw himself, but because of how the industry saw him. He knew the whispers, the jokes, the endless camera tricks weren't about art. They were about hiding. Studio executives, protective of his image, demanded strict casting rules. His leading ladies had to be petite. Directors were briefed on how to shoot him, Any suggestion that Alan Ladd wasn't tall enough for the part was met with immediate rejection. His fragility wasn't just physical, it was emotional. He once said, "I'm shy and I can't help it. I'm not much of a talker, I'm like a little boy." And that's how many saw him off screen. Gentle, withdrawn, searching for peace in a world that only loved the mask. His life ended too soon. At 50, a cocktail of alcohol, sedatives, and sleeping pills silenced him forever. But his image, Alan Ladd, the impossibly cool man in the trench coat, the lonesome cowboy in Shane, lived on. He never stood tall in the literal sense, but with each role, he proved that presence, not height, made a legend. Number 4. Mickey Rooney, 5 foot 2 inches, the eternal boy who outgrew the frame. Mickey Rooney's face was once as familiar as the American flag. He was the kid next door, the class clown, the scrappy sidekick, and, briefly, the biggest box office star in the world. From the moment he stepped on stage, he radiated energy like a sunbeam bouncing off a pinball machine. But he never grew very tall. By adulthood, Mickey Rooney stood somewhere between 5'1" and 5'3", depending on the source, the shoes, and the studio illusion, but even the most generous estimate couldn't stretch the truth. Mickey was short, and in Hollywood, that became both his calling card and his curse. As a child, it was a gift. His compact size kept him playing younger, longer. In the 1930s and early 40s, he was Andy Hardy, the all-American boy, bounding through wholesome dilemmas with a grin and a wink. Audiences adored him. MGM couldn't shoot his movies fast enough, but Mickey had a secret. He was aging, quietly. His body matured, his voice deepened, but his stature stayed boyish. And as the war years faded, so did the appetite for Mickey's man-child charm. Hollywood no longer knew what to do with him. He wasn't tall enough to be a romantic lead. He wasn't handsome in the traditional sense. He wasn't rugged. He was still Mickey Rooney. Full of fire, full of life, but now too old to play the boy and too small to play the man. The fall was brutal. The roles dried up. He pivoted to vaudeville, television, character roles. His personal life was chaotic. 8 marriages, financial ruin, and years of being dismissed as a has-been. But through it all, he fought. He endured. He refused to shrink, even as Hollywood tried to forget him. And then he came back. Older, weathered, unapologetically small, but unmistakably mighty. In The Black Stallion, he was nominated for an Oscar. In Night at the Museum, he made kids laugh again. He never stopped working. Mickey Rooney wasn't a tall man, but he was a giant in one very specific way. He lived without quitting. For nearly 9 decades, he proved that the brightest lights can come in the smallest packages. He wasn't a star. He was a supernova. Compact, explosive, unforgettable. Number 3, Frankie Darro. 5 foot 3 inches, the kid who couldn't grow up. If you blinked, you might have missed him, but not because Frankie Darro didn't shine. He did, brightly, fiercely, restlessly, but like a firecracker fizzing just above the pavement, Frankie's spark was always tethered to the ground. He stood at 5 feet 3 inches, though he often looked smaller, compact, wiry, a perpetual teenager well into his 30s. That was both his gift and his undoing. Frankie was born into a traveling circus. Acrobatics ran in his blood. By the time he was a teenager, he was flipping off balconies in B-movies, playing streetwise kids with too much grit and not enough luck. He was fast-talking, chip on his shoulder, Depression-era dynamite. The kind of boy who looked like he'd punched his way out of a bread line and could out-talk a cop before breakfast. But Frankie didn't just play the part, he lived it. He worked non-stop through the 30s and 40s, his slight frame making him perfect for youthful roles. He could fall off a roof, hop on a motorcycle, slide through a skylight. No stuntman needed. He did his own work, often to his own detriment. Directors loved his energy. Studios loved his size. Then he got older. His face hardened. The baby fat vanished. But the roles didn't change. Hollywood couldn't see past the frame. Frankie still looked like a kid, too short to be a cop, too boyish to be a husband, too slight to be a threat. He was frozen in time, forever 15, in a town that only wanted him to stay there. So he drifted, took bit parts, played sidekicks, crooks, wise guys. Famously, he was inside Robbie the Robot in Forbidden Planet. Invisible, yet essential. It was a metaphor, really. He powered the machine, but no one saw the man. Like many stars who couldn't outgrow their screen image, Frankie battled personal demons: alcohol, poverty, resentment. He'd once been a star, now he was a trivia answer. And yet, watch his films. Watch Wild Boys of the Road or The Mayor of Hell. There's something electric there, something that couldn't be faked. He may have been too small to command a Western horse lineup, but emotionally, he hit harder than most 6-foot actors could dream. Frankie Darro was the kid who never got to grow into his fame. But in the space he did occupy, between stunts, snarls, and silent heartbreak, he left behind something indelible, a whisper of what Hollywood missed because it was looking too high. Number 2, Jerry Marin, 4 feet, the last of the Lollipop Guild. He stood just over 4 feet tall, but his legacy, it stretched across generations. Jerry Marin was never meant to be famous, not in the way Hollywood defines it. He didn't have leading man looks. He didn't tower above his co-stars. In fact, he was barely visible in the room unless you were looking for him. But in 1939, at just 18 years old, Jerry Marin became immortal, with a song, a dance, and a lollipop. In The Wizard of Oz, Jerry played one of the Lollipop Guild munchkins, arguably the most iconic group of little people in film history. His screen time was short, but seared into collective memory. That little green suit, the exaggerated handoff of the candy, the cartoonish voice, it was the kind of moment only Hollywood's golden age could produce. Magical, surreal, and oddly bittersweet. Because what most audiences didn't realize was that behind the whimsy was a young man fighting to be seen as more than a novelty. Jerry Marin was born Gerald Marenghi in 1920 in Boston. The youngest of 11, he was the only one born with dwarfism. His parents, confused but supportive, put him in dance school early. He was a natural. Rhythm was his refuge, and it became his ticket to Hollywood. But after Oz, the roles came slow and steeped in stereotype. Circus performers, comic relief, creatures in costume. He played aliens, puppets, elves. He appeared in Planet of the Apes, The Twilight Zone, Battle for the Planet of the Apes, and dozens of uncredited roles that asked only one thing of him: be small. And yet, Jerry kept showing up. For 7 decades he worked, always cheerful, always professional. He became the go-to performer for roles others wouldn't take or couldn't endure. And through it all, he maintained dignity, humor, and a quiet pride. Later in life, as the last surviving adult munchkin from The Wizard of Oz, he was suddenly celebrated, honored with a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, paraded at conventions, photographed with fans. He'd lived long enough to see the world change and to see himself reimagined as a legend. Jerry Marin never got the roles he deserved, but he got something perhaps more profound. He became part of the fabric of American cinema, not by towering over it, but by becoming its smallest, most unforgettable thread. Number 1, Billy Barty, 3 feet 9 inches, the smallest giant in Hollywood. There are stars who fade with time. There are stars who burn brightly and briefly. And then, there are stars like Billy Barty, small in frame, immense in force, and utterly impossible to forget. At 3 feet 9 inches tall, Billy Barty was one of the shortest actors in Hollywood history, but he may have had the biggest impact of any on this list, not just as an actor, but as an advocate, a pioneer, and a man who redefined what visibility meant. He began working in film before he could walk. As a child in the 1920s, he was cast in silent comedies, his tiny stature perfect for sight gags and mischief. By the 1930s, he was a staple of slapstick shorts. When talkies came, so did the caricatures, elves, imps, mascots, roles that required him to play funny because small. Hollywood gave him work, but never dignity. But Billy didn't just accept the roles, he transcended them. He was agile, expressive, bursting with comedic timing. In a sea of stereotypes, he infused his characters with wit, warmth, and, most importantly, humanity. And then, in the 1950s, he did something extraordinary. He took his fame and turned it into purpose. Billy founded Little People of America, a support and advocacy organization for people with dwarfism. It wasn't about acting, it was about life, about access, education, respect, about reshaping the narrative from the inside out. He never stopped working. His career spanned more than 7 decades. From Willow to Under the Rainbow, Foul Play to The Bride of Frankenstein, he became the go-to performer when a role demanded not just a small actor, but a great one. And off-screen, he was beloved, generous, funny, fierce. He refused to be pitied. He refused to be typecast. He once said, "The hardest thing in the world is to get the public to accept you as more than just a novelty." And yet somehow Billy made it look easy. He wasn't a novelty. He was a phenomenon. And when he passed in 2000 at the age of 76, he left behind more than a filmography. He left a legacy of inclusion, a legacy of resistance, a legacy of standing tall when the world tried to look over him. Billy Barty wasn't just a short actor, he was a giant by every measure that truly matters. The illusion of height, the reality of power. In Hollywood, perception is everything. The camera lies for a living. It stretches, flatters, sculpts legends out of shadows. It takes 5-foot men and turns them into titans. It crowns 5'2" women as queens of the screen. And yet, behind all the lights and lenses, the truth remains. The most towering presences weren't always tall. They were compelling. They were vulnerable. They were relentless. Mary Pickford turned her petite frame into an empire. Joan Crawford weaponized angles and ambition. Bette Davis defied every norm, not with size, but with force. Bogart, Falk, Ladd, they reinvented masculinity itself, not by rising above, but by digging deeper. Rooney, Darrow, Marin, Barty, they were never meant to be giants, and yet they are the names we remember, because in the end, size is not the measure of greatness. It's not how tall you stood on set. It's how deeply you imprinted on our collective memory. These actors, these legends, proved that height may shape a role, but it never defines a legacy. What they left behind wasn't measured in inches. It was measured in impact. And in that regard, they all stood taller than the rest. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment down below as it helps support this channel. Also, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our newest videos. Thanks for watching.